All right, welcome back, guys. I'm back from my short break. Happy New Year to you all. And today we're testing the RX 7800 XT in Frontiers of Pandora, Avatar, obviously. All right, so today we're pairing this with a 12700K CPU. That again is paired with DDR4 3600 MHz CL14 memory. I know it's not the fastest memory, but it's got pretty low or pretty fast timings, and you know what I mean. Anyway, so we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. And let's just go over the settings here quickly. Let me get rid of that. So if we just go over the settings here, currently we're just on the ultra preset, right? Nothing's changed there, and we're in full screen mode. And just the capture card is 60 hertz, so you'll see some screen tearing being recorded. We don't have any frame generation, and you need to disable the scaling mode. Yeah, so that means we'll be running at native, but we'll be using FSR Native. You'll see that we've got FSR enabled here. So the temporal upscaler will be FSR or FAA, which just means FSR AA, so native resolution, and no frame rate limits, no VSync, no nothing. Now, just one thing that you need to notice, this game does use ray tracing. If you go through the settings here, you'll see that reflections and some other settings use ray tracing. So the performance out of the box might not be what a lot of people are expecting, but remember that it does have ray tracing. So when you get to high resolutions, upscaling will definitely be necessary. All right, so let's just get right to it. Let me get the numbers up here, and let's reset the numbers. Now, for those of you new here, I just have a bunch of numbers in the top left-hand corner there. We've got our GPU usage, our VRAM allocated, and our VRAM usage. Then we've got our GPU clocks. Those are the core clocks as well as the memory clocks. And I'm including the fan speed so that you can get an idea of more or less how loud this GPU would be. I mean, you won't be able to hear it, but 35% fan speed is pretty low. This GPU is very quiet, and it's running quite cool, 60 degrees more or less, and we're in the middle of summer. It's it's very hot here, so this is actually very impressive. So we've got our CPU usage and clock speeds, power, everything there as well. And then we've got the most important ones, the frame rate, the current frame rate. Then we've got the average, 1% lows and 0.1% lows. All right, so the 1% and 0.1% lows would basically just indicate stutters. All right, so as you can see at 1080p on the ultra preset, we're getting around 68 frames per second, right? So this is the start of the game. Well, when you enter Pandora for the first time, you do come out of this tunnel. You spend the first half an hour in there pretty much. Anyway, so this is a pretty demanding scene, not the most demanding, but it's very easy to replicate this run. That's why I'm doing it, yeah. And then just another thing, this game does seem to use more VRAM the more there is available, because I've tested this on the 4070 Ti and 4070, and both of them have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and we never went above that. Whereas with this 16 gigabyte GPU, it says it's using 12.5. Anyway, let's get right to the next test. Let's test a little bit with some upscaling. Right, so all we'll do is we'll just enable scaling mode here to fixed. And ultra quality, look, I'm not entirely sure what this means. I've played around a little bit. I know that FSR does have an ultra quality preset, but this same thing pops up with TAA and DLSS. DLSS ultra quality usually means DLAA, but in this case it doesn't. Anyway, so let's just go with quality here. I mean, we did get 60 frames per second average. You'll get that right through the whole game. There's no issues with that. And but if you do have a high refresh rate monitor, you play at 1080p with this GPU, which is, I mean, perfectly fine. You do you, and you just want to get a higher refresh rate experience here. So getting around 100 frames per second now with FSR. One thing though with FSR is that the water reflections, they seem to be a little bit not so nice to look at. Apologies for the lack of vocabulary there. But if you want to see a very deep or much deeper analysis into this game, watch the Digital Foundry video. Alex did a very good job analyzing this for the PS5, the Xbox, and PC as well. But this game is extremely good looking, especially when you crank the settings a little bit. This is not even on its highest settings. You do get unobtainium settings that you can unlock using a console command. I'm not going to be doing that because the performance hit is quite extreme. Even on the 4070 Ti at 1440p, it does become You still get around 60 frames per second with all the settings enabled, but I mean it's it's quite hard on the system. But now you can see, just using FSR Quality, we got around 100 frames per second here, which is pretty good. Still not 144 hertz if you do have a 144 hertz monitor, but that's the nice thing about this game, is that it does have native support for FSR frame generation, right? So FSR 3 frame generation, you can enable this. I'm not going to be enabling now because I've got MSI Afterburner running, and the game it doesn't like both of those, or it doesn't like MSI Afterburner running when you enable frame generation. So we'll get to the frame generation benchmarks later in the video. I just want to finish the normal benchmarks, and then at the end we'll do the frame generation ones. Right, so got about 100 frames per second here. Let's just turn this down to high, which I do think is pretty okay. I mean, this is good enough for most people. You shouldn't be really playing at ultra anyway. Like, it's just a waste of resources. Just these are just the settings. High is still plenty high. It's just a name for a preset. But before we do that, let's just disable our scaling here. So whoops, will be over here. All right, so it's been a while. So native 1080p, just on the high preset this time. So we got around 60 frames per second, previously 68 if I remember correctly on the ultra preset. Now you can see that's a nice bump up to 80 frames per second, give or take. So now if you use FSR, even on the quality preset, you'll get a decent bump into the hundreds, and then you can enable frame generation. You'll get to 144 quite easily, and you'll have a very good experience actually. FSR 3 frame generation in this game doesn't really have that a big input latency penalty. For some reason the implementation seems to be quite good. I actually play on the Nvidia GPUs. I use the DLSS 3 frame gen mod because this game doesn't support DLSS 3 frame generation natively, unfortunately. But FSR 3 is not without its issues in this game, unfortunately. You do need a very high frame rate, otherwise you do get some VSync judder. That's what they actually call it. You'll see that the frame times aren't really that smooth with frame generation enabled. But if you stay above 120 frames per second, it's not really that noticeable. I know these tests seem to be quite useless at 1080p. Right, I'm just testing all the resolutions with most of the settings here, just to give you an idea. Some people do play at 1080p with this GPU, others will be playing at 1440p, others at 4K. So just want to give you all the settings here. Just one note, I'm not really a big fan of upscaling at 1080p, but in this game it actually doesn't look too bad. All right, so now talking about upscaling, let's enable that. Right, so we'll just use, I need to remember where it is. So just the FSR Quality at 1080p on the high preset, right? All right, so this issue I've actually seen when I reset the numbers, the 1% and 0.1% lows take a big hit immediately. But now you see we went from around 80 frames per second to just above 100 frames per second, which is a pretty nice bump here. And as I said, if you just enable frame generation, you'll get 140 frames per second plus quite easily at these settings. Now, the amazing thing about this game is because it's so visually stunning, it's very heavy on the GPU. You can see our GPU usage there is pegged at 100%. We're definitely not seeing any kind of CPU limitation here. I know that the 12700K is quite a beastly CPU for these kind of benchmarks. Not a lot of people would be pairing a 12700K with a 7800 XT or 4070, for example. But the purpose of these videos is to test GPUs and not CPUs. So I'm trying to alleviate CPU bottlenecks as far as I can, just to gouge GPU performance. All right, so I think that's enough for 1080p. Let's move over to 1440p. And as I said, we'll test the frame generation. We'll do the frame generation benchmarks at the end of the video. Right, but now at 1440p, back on the ultra preset, and just making sure we don't have any upscaling enabled, and we don't have any frame rate limits or frame generation enabled. So 1440p native on the ultra preset, and this is not going to go so well, believe it or not. Right, so getting mid 40s here, but this game does look extremely good at higher resolutions. I'm actually benchmarking this on a 4K monitor, so it looks kind of blurry on the monitor, but that's because the native resolutions don't match. at 4K, this game does shine. But you can just see there's so much detail in this game here, like the geometry of the terrain, the plant life, the denseness of the forest. Like it is such a good looking game, and I've actually finished it. It's a pretty decent game. I know a lot of people are over the Ubisoft formula. They don't really like it that much, and this game does suffer from the usual Ubisoft stuff, but just skip that. Like really, if you just play the main quests and you liberate all the bases are actually very fun to liberate. You're this overpowered big alien monster with a bow, and but you can be killed very easily, so you have to be tactical about it. And I just think that this game is quite fun. Anyway, so around 45 frames per second, yeah, 46 to be exact before I get called out. 46 frames per second, but then again, this is on the ultra preset, but let's see if we can actually get 60 frames per second by just enabling FSR super resolution. Yeah, I know I said FSR super resolution, but it does it's pretty much what it's called, right? So this is Fidelity FX super resolution frame generation, and then you get super resolution. Oh, it's confusing. Anyway, so we'll enable upscaling if that makes it sound a little bit better. So just the FSR set to quality, no frame generation still. All right, and let's just reset our numbers. And I mean, we almost doubled our frame rate, so from 45 to around 70 frames per second. So not really double, but a lot of people get triggered by misspeaking. So let's just call it what it is. We went from 45 frames per second to 65 frames per second, and that's a pretty decent bump in performance, probably around 33%, whatever, if I have to do math at the top of my head here, off the top of my head. Math was never my strongest subject in school. Anyway, 68 frames per second. So if you're aiming for 60 frames per second at 1440p, you can easily achieve that on the ultra preset by just using FSR set to quality, right? And at this resolution, you'll be fine even going down to FSR Balanced. FSR does introduce some shimmering, like if we compare it with the DLSS, especially these insects that fly. You probably won't see it in this video. You'll have to slow it down or all that kind of stuff. But there's some shimmering with FSR, especially on the more aggressive settings. But the game still looks plenty good. Trust me, it's really worth your time. Anyway, so 70 frames per second. Let's see if we can get that a little bit higher if we just enable DLSS, not DLSS, FSR, set to the balanced preset here. And I'm not sure how much we would gain here. I'm not guessing we'll get 100 frames per second, but we'll probably get around 85 and 90 frames per second, right? And there we go. So, I mean, you could have sworn I've probably tested this before recording this video, and that's exactly what I do. I do test all these settings before I actually record videos, and then I spot check my results online to make sure that I'm more or less in the ballpark figure of what this GPU is supposed to be doing, just to make sure that I've got all my settings correct. So if you do see comments saying that they get double the frame rate with these same specs, like, highly unlikely, I can promise you that. Most of them have been debunked. Some people do make mistakes. They accidentally leave on frame generation, or they leave on upscaling, that kind of stuff. But I mean, this is pretty much as good as it'll get, right? So you can get more frame you can get a high frame rate by overclocking the GPU a little bit, and some models do perform slightly better than others. This model is actually not too terrible. This is the XFX 319 Qick model, so it's not the most entry-level one, but it's not the highest one either. But as you can see, we had an average of around 77 frames per second. My guess is we'll probably get around 100 frames per second once we enable frame generation, but we'll leave that till the end of this video, as I said. All right, so now let's just drop this down to the high preset. And like I said, there's not that big a difference between ultra and high, but there is quite a big difference in performance, right? So let's just make sure that we do disable any upscaling here. So 1440p native at on the high preset. Let's see how this goes. I'm guessing maybe 55, 60 frames per second. And can you believe it? Like, once again, I guess correctly. This is actually a a pretty good experience. This, like, just above 50 frames per second is not terrible for this game. The input latency feels perfectly fine. As I said, I'm recording this on a 4K monitor. It's actually a 4K 60 hertz monitor, and but I do play when I play, I play on a 165 hertz monitor. It's just that that's only a 1440p monitor, and I want to test at native resolutions. So I want to benchmark at native resolution. So that's the only reason why we've only got a 60 hertz monitor for the benchmarking PC. But it's definitely not bad. As I said, this is a 60 hertz monitor. We're getting just under 60 frames per second, and without VSync, there's some screen tearing right just as you go above 60 frames per second. But this is actually not a terrible experience. I'd be able to play like this. I do prefer 60 and above, but if you don't want to use upscaling, right, this is pretty close to 60, and you'll be happy. Anyway, enough chit chat. Let's just enable some upscaling here. Like I always keep on forgetting where this is. Like it's just different how it works. Anyway, so let's just FSR set to quality here. Right, and now we'll maintain 60 frames per second quite easily all the time. I mean, we're getting 90 frames per second. So if you do want a higher refresh rate experience here, then this gets close to what I'd call a high refresh rate experience. I'd consider 100 frames per second, probably like 120, 144. That's a real high refresh rate experience. So anything above 100 would be perfectly fine, I'd say. Anyway, like we're not getting much benefit going from 60 to 90, right? There is motion fluidity improvement, obviously, but if you want to max out a 120 hertz monitor, then you're falling well short with this. So I do think if we enable frame generation, we'll get above 120 frames per second, or close to at least, and FSR Balanced should be perfectly fine here as well. All right, so let's just go ahead and do that. We'll do FSR set to Balanced here, and we should be getting like 110 frames per second here. Let me just I lied, we didn't gain that much. So 85 frames per second going to 100 frames per second here. I think probably it'll be better to play on FSR Quality and then just use FSR 3 frame generation in this case, because we dropped the internal resolution going from quality to balanced, but we didn't gain that much, right? Maybe 10%, I don't know. I don't really keep track of all the numbers in my head, but we were getting around 90 frames per second anyway previously. It might be slightly higher now, but not much, like not worth the visual sacrifice anyway. As you can see that the reflections in the water definitely take a hit the more aggressive upscaling setting you use. All right, I'd say over here we're getting around 140 frames per second, so definitely higher than previously, and we're now almost maxing out our 165 at once. Like, okay, what's happening now? Now we're getting 120 frames per second. Like, okay, I've got no idea what's happening here. I mean, previously this was stuck at 90 frames per second, 100 frames per second. I didn't change a thing. Like, I'm not going to cut anything in between with this run. Like, this is just very strange. I did see some strange behavior with the 12 or Adrenaline 2312.1 driver on the RX 7600. I could not play this game at 1080p on the Ultra preset. It would just crash, right? Or maybe it's the time of day that changed. Like, I've got no idea what's happening here. Like, now we're back to what we were seeing, and now it's actually, now it's lower again. Like, interesting stuff. So this is what we were seeing previously, and then all of a sudden we just gained like 30% in the frame rate. Anyway, weird stuff. So right, that's it. So we'll move on to the next preset. I think it's still fine to use the medium preset at 1440p, right? So let's just go down to medium, yeah. And I don't think we'll be testing too many FSR settings here, but let's just disable FSR quickly. And so this is, did the game crash? I think the game crashed. All right, the game did not crash. Just seeing some weird stuff here. And previously on the RX 7600, rolling back the driver fixed some of the issues, but this is actually the driver, or the game ready driver from AMD. So that's what I'm testing with that. And now we're getting, we're getting 70 frames per second. The first time we're getting above 60 frames per second at 1440p. Once again, remember that there's ray tracing involved, a lot of ray tracing. You can see even on the medium preset, like there's a mixture of screen space reflections as well as ray traced reflections. The lighting is just spectacular in this game. I do think that previously we might have just experienced time of day change, and global illumination might have something to do with the big frame rate increase we saw. And I don't know, that's just my speculation. I've got no idea what exactly happened there. I'm just here to test some GPUs. All right, so getting just above 60 frames per second. And if you want to lock it to 60 frames per second, you probably can. Just use VSync if you've got a 60 Hz monitor, and play on the medium preset. No need for any upscaling whatsoever, and you'll probably just maintain 60 frames per second most of the time. Anyway, just look at our lows there. Very close to our averages there, so not a lot of stuttering at all. All right, so let's just do the rest of the stuff here. We'll do not frame generation. We'll use scaling. We'll just use a quality once again. Right, so 1440p on the medium preset this time, or still, and FSR set to quality, and whoops, I pressed the wrong button. 100 frames per second. There we go. So we should probably be getting closer to 120 now if we move to DLSS Balanced. I keep on calling it DLSS, sorry, FSR Balanced. It's the same thing basically. It's upscaling. It's not the same thing. Don't quote me on that. It's definitely not the same thing, but upscaling, it uses more or less the same internal resolutions for its upscaling. That's pretty much where it ends. Anyway, so around 100 frames per second, definitely not terrible at 1440p medium preset. To be honest, this is where I actually played this game when I played a lot of time on the RTX 4070, purely because it's summer here. It's very, very warm. I would power limit the 4070 to 140 watts just to keep the heat down, and then I'll use the DLSS 3 frame generation mod. I'll get around 140 frames per second, and it'll use 140 watts, so that's extremely efficient. Whereas this at the moment, I mean, it does use quite a bit more power than the 4070 for more or less the same performance, right? The 4070 still beats it when it comes to ray tracing, but the 7800 XT does have a slight advantage when it comes to rasterization performance. All right, so should we test? I think we should. I think we should test just the FSR set to balanced. Yeah, let's see if we can get to 120 frames per second. Yeah, at 1440p on the medium preset. Let's press the right buttons this time. I mean, it's close enough, right? It's 110 frames per second. Close enough to 120, so I mean it won't maintain 110 or even 120. The upper plains area of the map is actually a little bit more intensive than this specific area, but it's a lot more open, and it's quite strange. I do think that the draw distance actually makes a big difference there, but also there's a lot of wind and a lot of tall grass, so the grass reacts to the wind, and that actually affects performance quite a bit. You'll be getting 120 frames per second. Suddenly the wind starts blowing, and that'll drop down to 100 frames per second. So the game is pretty demanding, but there's also a lot of cool features in it. Anyway, 110 frames per second average, and pretty good, I'd say. All right, this video is getting quite long, and you're probably getting quite bored. So let's just move this over to 4K. We'll probably not test too many settings at 4K, because even though this GPU does have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, the performance is not really meant for 4K native, right? And anything that you have to use upscaling for is not really 4K, right? It's being upscaled to 4K, so it's not true 4K. Anyway, that's not what we're here to debate. We'll just disable scaling quickly. I do know that we are on the Ultra preset at 4K, I just want to give you an idea what the performance is like. 4K, no upscaling, right? So this might not go so well. And let's just get our numbers back up, yeah. And 25 frames per second, 22. Let me just reset the numbers again. You can see that the lows are struggling quite a bit. I'm struggling to speak as well. There's a lot of stuttering happening here now. That's as I said, yeah, like it freezes for like a split second, but the frame time graph does not show that. Very weird. But the 1% lows do show that. So not entirely sure what's happening here. As I said, I did have some issues with this specific driver 23.12.1, and rolling back to the 23.11.1 driver solved a lot of issues. So maybe try that if you do have this GPU and you are seeing these specific issues I'm seeing, but definitely not playable at 4K native. All right, so let's just use realistic settings then. All right, so we'll do 4K on the medium preset, and let's just first see how much performance we gained just by going to the medium preset here. I mean, we went from 24 to 34 frames per second. Sorry, now we can actually see the frame time graph spikes, right? Yeah, so it looks like it's periodic. It's identical every time. Yeah, there we go. So I'm not even doing anything. Just look at the frame time graph there. I'll zoom in editing. Sorry, I did forget to increase the size of the overlay, but you can see there's quite a bit of frame time issues here now. We are seeing that constant spiking, even though I'm standing still. I mean, I'm not standing still at the moment, but it happened even when I was standing still. So 4K native, not really such a good idea. And as I said, I'm not entirely sure why that frame time graph looks the way it does. Anyway, so let's just go ahead and use respectable settings here. We'll use I'll say we'll use DLSS or FSR Balanced. FSR, keep on calling it DLSS. So FSR Balanced on the medium preset. I think we should be close to 60 frames per second, and maybe we'll be able to get rid of that frame time spikes there. So just above 60 frames per second, but those frame time spikes are still there. Right, this is pretty weird. I do think that restarting the game probably will fix it, but this is not a terrible experience. It actually feels very good, except for those ridiculous frame time spikes. It looks great. This game just look at the texture detail on this rock here. Like it's really, really good. And one of my favorite games of 2023. I finished it like on the 28th of December, I think. Loved it. I played about 3 weeks, and I did rush it a little bit at the end just because I needed to start making videos again, and I knew I wouldn't if I was still playing Avatar. So I mean, just look at the lighting here, reflecting off the ground there. Like it's just so good. Anyway, yeah, as I said, maybe I'll just post an update or I'll pin a comment just to tell you whether rolling back the driver actually fixes the stuttering issues. It did for the 7600, so I'm pretty sure it should for the 7800 XT. Anyway, so right, so that's it for our normal testing. I think now it's time to do some frame generation testing. Right, so now we are back, and let me just show you the settings quickly. So we are on the Ultra preset at 1080p. We don't have any scaling, but we do have frame generation enabled here. And I'll be testing with FSR Super Resolution and without. So for now, it's just a native resolution because a lot of people ask me why I don't test it like that. And the reason is that frame generation increases input latency, right? So the best way to mitigate that is to boost your base frame rate, and that you can do by using upscaling. So I generally just use DLSS Quality or Balanced, depending on which resolution I'm playing at, before I enable frame generation. That's on the NVIDIA side. This is only the third game to natively support FSR3 frame generation. There are a lot of mods for a lot of games out there, but you can see we gained quite a lot from enabling frame generation here, right? So this is just the normal FSR3 frame generation, and at this frame rate, as I said, like I'm not noticing that VSync judder. So anything like close to 120 frames per second feels perfectly fine. Like it feels better. Let me put it that way. Like there is still some instances where it is visible, but it's usable. It's great. I think FSR 3 is pretty good. It did what Nvidia couldn't and enabled frame generation for people with RTX 30 series, 20 series, GTX 10 series GPUs, and obviously AMD uses GPUs as well. So AMD does have a slight advantage here because they have anti-lag, whereas most of the games that have the implementation natively, there's no NVIDIA reflex, right? All right, so anyway, let's just use FSR Quality here with frame generation on, and I'm guessing you'll probably get 160 plus frames per second here. It does boost your frame rate quite a lot, by a lot more than what I was expecting. Okay, so this would fully max out my 165 hertz panel. I mean, we're getting 180 frames per second at times, 170 frames per second average. So I'd probably say limit this to 144 frames per second, or just switch your monitor to 144 hertz, enable VSync. And what's that about? I'm getting 266 frames per second. And now it's the time of day that changes again. So I do think that my testing is not that scientific, obviously, because the time of day does change. The best way to test this would be to restart the game after each and every setting, and then also to restart the save after each and every setting. The issue is that the game does autosave when you exit, and there is dynamic time of day. So as you can see, the performance does vary between time of day as well, especially when there's a time of day cycle. Now we're back to where we were. So during that transition, the frame rate is much higher. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So I'd say we still got an average of around 170 frames per second, right? Just looking at this 160 frames per second in this specific area, and that's actually very solid if you are looking for a very high refresh rate experience. I'm going to say experience, even though you do have a slight input latency, additional input latency on a 1080p monitor. This is great. All right, so let's just go ahead, and I'm not going to be testing on the medium preset. I'm just going to move on to the next resolution. Yeah, so we'll be testing on the ultra preset again, 1440p, and we'll just once again use the native setting. Yeah, I think what did we get on ultra? Like 40 frames per second, 45 frames per second, right? So this will get you above 60 frames per second, definitely. Like it almost doubles your frame rate. But now the input latency it'll be noticeable. It's not great. We are now seeing that VSync judder issue, and this is not how you're supposed to be using frame generation. I do have a few videos on frame generation out, and the one is called frame generation, you're doing it wrong. And this is exactly what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't be targeting 60 frames per second with frame generation. You should be targeting a high refresh rate experience, or maximizing your high refresh rate panel, right? Getting just above 80 frames per second, like there is a lot of input latency. And I'm moving the mouse quite a lot. That's just me testing the input latency, but the input latency is quite bad. Not terrible, but it's definitely noticeable. If we just enable FSR Quality, we'll boost this to 120 frames per second. The input latency will be a lot better. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And let's just go, yeah, I think let's just leave it on the ultra preset, right? Just for testing now, we'll just use FSR set to quality. All right, so FSR Quality ultra preset 1440p, getting 130 frames per second. Now the input latency is much better, and we can actually enable anti-lag in the Radeon drivers. That'll mitigate a lot of the input latency as well. And then we can also use anti-lag plus once they officially release it again. There was some issues with Counter-Strike 2 where people using anti-lag plus got banned, so they removed it from the driver suite for now until they can fix that issue. But when it's back there, it does actually offer quite a significant reduction in input latency. All right, this is actually a very good experience. This is better than the RTX 4070 with the LSS3 frame generation by quite a stretch. I think we're getting like 120, 140 frames per second. FSR 3 frame generation does seem to boost the frame rate quite a bit more than DLSS 3 frame generation in this game that I've seen. I think it's because it works on the software side. It might have slightly less overhead than DLSS 3 frame generation, but don't quote me on that. It'll differ from game to game. Anyway, this was a pretty good experience at 1440p, and if I had to daily this GPU on a 1440p monitor, this is where I'd be playing it. These are the settings I'd use. Maybe drop it down to high, which we'll do now. I'm just going to leave the exact same settings with regards to frame generation and FSR. So let's just drop this down to high, just to give you an idea of what the performance would be like. Remember, we were getting around 130 here, and now we're getting 160. So if you are chasing a higher frame rate, just use the high preset. It looks plenty good. It's not as taxing as ultra, and unless you're pixel peeping, you're not going to be noticing the difference. Maybe in the reflections. I know I talk about reflections quite a bit, but this game does have some issues with its reflections if you're not playing on the highest settings. And I mean, just I don't know. This is a very, very solid experience. I'd be more than happy to play it like this. I'd probably cap it to 165 on my 165. It's 1440p monitor, and just play it like that. Save a bit on the power usage, and have a pretty good experience. All right, that's it for 1440p. Let's see what happens at 4K. All right, we're at 4K on the Ultra preset. I do have frame generation enabled, but nothing else. Remember, we got 24 frames per second previously, right? So I just want to show you what frame generation can do here for you, and why you shouldn't be using it like this. Okay, so we went from 24 to 44 frames per second. The game looks stunning at 4K, especially on a 27-inch 4K monitor. Yeah, there's very few games that'll beat this. Digital Foundry actually awarded this the best looking game of 2023, and I have to agree. Like, it's barring one or two issues, like, this game just looks brilliant, but the input latency is horrendous. Like, it really is. If you go from 24 frames per second to 50 frames per second using frame generation, you're going to have a very, very tough time. Trust me, especially in a first-person shooter game like this. Maybe when you play Diablo 4, it's not going to matter that much, but this is not the way you'd want to play this game. Like, trust me. Anyway, so let's just once again use respectable settings. I am actually going to be using the high preset, right? And what we'll do is we'll use the high preset, and we'll use FSR super resolution. We'll use it on the balanced preset, right? So frame generation enabled, FSR 3 or FSR super resolution on the balanced, and this is on the high preset, right? Okay, so we've got all the settings there, and frame generation enabled. I'm getting 100 frames per second. Like, that's impressive. And as I said, sure, the input latency is probably not the best. We can mitigate that by using Radeon anti-lag. It's not enabled at the moment. You can just enable it in the software side. You can enable it per game or globally. This is a very, very good experience. I mean, this is at 4K. So I mean, 4K output resolution. It's much lower internal resolution, but it does a pretty good job of upscaling to 4K. Like, especially in this game, it just everything just looks so good, so crisp. If you've watched any of my previous videos on this game, you'd probably be tired of me talking about how good this game looks, but it never gets old just looking at the stunning visuals. And as I said, at 4K DLSS balanced, you're getting 100 frames per second, so what's not to like? All right, that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.